You are listening to the Body Charge podcast, and I'm your host, Sandy Sanderson. I'm honoured today to have my guest as Dr. Robert Yoho. He is 67 years old and retired 2 years ago to become an author. He brings with him much experience as a board-certified emergency physician and later as a certified cosmetic surgeon who specialised in breast enhancement, liposuction and facial procedures. His recent whistleblower books are Butchered by Healthcare and Hormone Secrets. Dr. Yoho, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sandy. Let me just put in a 10-second disclaimer. First of all, even though I practiced medicine for my whole life and it had advanced training and degrees and all that, you don't have to doctor me here. I'm Robert. And second of all, this is not specific medical advice. If you need healthcare, get it from your physicians and other providers. So that's the disclaimer.
Yes, we're here really to empower people and just to share information from personal experience, and people can take on board what they think is relevant for their own use.
Exactly.
It's a little bit like an information smorgasbord, isn't it? You pick what you want. So the title of today's podcast is Psychiatry Heading for Extinction? So we're going to discuss a little bit about the relevance of what we call psychiatry in the current medical system. And is it enough? Is it doing enough to help people recover from stress and mental illness? So those two things go together, because we know excessive stress and traumas are usually the triggers that then eventually lead to some kind of mental disorder, perhaps like PTSD, depression, a whole raft of different kind of mental abnormalities. And when people feel something's not right, or they're not thinking properly, or they've lost confidence, or they just lost the zest for life, and they can't pick up the pieces, they don't know what to do, they're in real distress, it's affecting their job, their family. So the first thing they might do is go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, I'm feeling so bad." And what the GP might do is give them some medications, might give them some benzodiazepines and Valium or something else, depending on what the issue is. And what we're seeing now is a huge uptick in the incidences of mental illness, and also addictions to medications. So the question is, are we heading in the right direction with just grabbing drugs to solve the problems? And if you can just elucidate on how the medical system got to this stage and why it's not really helping us the way we expect.
Okay, so the basic numbers are that, I'm obviously wrote this book about America, right? But don't think that Australia is exempt. Australia has plenty of problems. It interlocks with our system. And as far as I can tell, we export every bad idea that we have to Europe and Australia and Canada. So in America, the health services cost twice what it costs in Australia, Canada, and Europe. In other words, we spend almost 20% of our gross domestic product on healthcare. Warren Buffett calls it the tapeworm of our economy. It's crazy. And he thinks that we've got to solve this problem or the whole economy is going to crash. But what's perhaps worse is that 50% of what we do and a whole lot of what you do is either ineffective or it's actually harmful to patients. And this is not academically controversial. There are plenty of papers that state this. And I mean, there are I have 500 references in my book to back up what I say. And we're going to cover this one small area of psychiatry, which I believe is one of the most corrupt specialty fields in medicine, but there's plenty more bad news. So how I got into this, I started reading bit by bit. And, you probably heard that old Indian story about the man with the elephant, who one guy has his hand on the elephant's trunk and the other guy has his hand on the elephant's toe, and they think that's the whole elephant. Well, there are plenty of corruption fighters in medicine, and they've written these books. And so I amalgamated all that information and put it all together for sort of a unified picture of the mess. And I got into this thing thinking I would uncover a can of worms, but what I found was a dumpster full of worms. So anyway, psychiatry is one of the worst problems. And the central problem in psychiatry is that they basically don't have any studies that support their drugs. Now, psychiatry became drug psychiatry 20 years ago. Before that, it was talking psychiatry. And now that we've got these biological theories and these ideas like the fact that they claim that drugs like Prozac, the SSRI antidepressants, cure a chemical imbalance in the brain. Now, you've heard that story, I'm sure. Well, that idea was invented in a marketing department at SmithKline Beecham. It's not a scientific thing. And actually the real scientists cringe when they hear that. Similarly, there's a dopamine theory of schizophrenia and other diseases. None of this stuff is confirmed science. What we have is a series of exceedingly toxic drugs that are promoted very heavily by their makers, by giving physicians money and having them, prescribe and promote these things, and worse yet, by altering the standards for their prescription through a document called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM. You've heard of that, I'm sure.
Yes.
So the DSM is almost entirely a creature of the medical industry. It's put together by doctors on the payroll, primarily by doctors on the payroll of big pharma and the psych drug company manufacturers.
Yes, I believe that there's a lot of terminology that they just invented and attached a series of symptoms to them, and those symptoms overlap many times many other kinds of conditions, and those symptoms can actually relate to something very physical going on in the body, something pathological. And my concern is that if you just rely on a title you've invented and a series of symptoms attached to that, how do you know that it's not another pathology that should be addressed that might be missed if you just give someone drugs to rebalance their dopamine or their serotonin under that? It's a theory, isn't it? It's really just theorizing, but without proofs or tests.
It's worse. It's actually voted on by the entire membership of the Psychiatric Association. So these things, and they spend a lot of time worrying about some their political correct ideas and terminology. It's based in very little. It's not based in study. Now, there's a central problem with the studies of the psychiatric medications, and that's they don't have adequate controls. That is the sugar pills. Now, in other words, what's happened in America is we've now got 17% of the entire population on psych drugs, right? And so it's hard to find somebody who would be appropriate candidate for a sugar pill. So they don't have good studies. Their ideas are entirely, fabricated from, these constructs that the psychiatrists put together. And the very definition of psychiatry is diseases that have no outer showing in laboratory tests or imaging studies. In other words, they call it functional medicine. And if there is any sign of thyroid disease or some other problem, they send it off to see the internist or someone else, and they don't treat them. They only treat things that are entirely subjective, and their studies are based entirely on their own surveys, written surveys, and their own impressions of what's going on, which is without placebo controls.
It's a bit artistic, isn't it? It's
very artistic.
Like looking at a picture and going, how do you interpret that piece of artwork? What's your take on it? But there's no like universal, this is right. So if you get a number of different psychiatrists providing an independent analysis or a diagnosis for someone, they could come up with completely different results, couldn't they? Or opinions.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And so it's entirely subjective, and these guys, basically.
So you can't prove anything. You can't prove any diagnosis. It's not provable, not testable. You can't get a scan. You can't get blood tests. You can't get a biopsy. You can't prove anything with independent physical testing.
That's correct. And so the only controls we have for psychiatry are the third world, right? Where they can't afford the drugs. So in the third world, these entities, these supposed disease entities that were constructed by votes in the American Psychiatric Association or whatever it is, these entities have better outcomes long-term in the third world without the drugs than they have in America. The other thing that's interesting is that the number of people on psychiatric disability has elevated in tandem with the drug use. And the chronicity of these diseases is thought to be due to the actual medication consumption by the acute observers. Now, psychiatry is unique among medical fields in that there is a large group of what we call psychiatry deniers. And these people don't believe the psychiatrists are legitimate at all. And they include large groups of psychologists, laymen. They include the Scientologists, but it's not all Scientologists. Scientologists have been against psychiatry since probably the 50s or the 60s, long before the drugs even became commonly used. But these psychiatric deniers, unlike any other field in medicine, they claim that psychiatry is entirely illegitimate. And I think with the way they're using these drugs promiscuously, I think they're right. I think that these drugs are used illegitimately on this vast swath of people. Anyone that walks in a doctor's office, even a primary care doctor's office with 2 weeks of depression, gets a prescription for an SSRI. And those things are toxic, very addictive.
Yeah, so it's the easy way out, isn't it? It's like you've got a headache and you're just popping aspirins and painkillers without actually addressing the problem that's causing the headache. So we're using psychiatric drugs the same way. We're not really looking at the underlying issues that might be there. We're just numbing and dumbing, and then that causes a problem to the liver, doesn't it? Because if you constantly take these medications long term, so initially you might have a medication that just calms everything down because you've gone into some kind of acute phase of hyperactivity, and in an acute situation, it's like just calm them down and stop them from overreacting. But then what happens after that? People get hooked on those medications and then they can't come off. And then if they come off, they have even worse reactions and side effects. And so they're really doomed to being on these medications for years, sometimes for the rest of their life. I don't really think that was meant to be that way. And then the liver has to cope with trying to get rid of all the waste products and the chemicals, and that people can't cope. And I read a lot of literature, such as the book Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime by Professor Peter Gotcha. He was the original founder of the Cochrane Review, and they went very, very deeply into psychiatry and looked at the studies. And you mentioned that before, that they didn't conduct high quality studies, and they cherry picked the data, or they hid data. For instance, many of the studies, if you took the raw data, which the Cochrane Review did, they showed that once they're on those psych drugs, there's a high propensity for them to develop suicidal ideation. So the ideas and the motivation to commit suicide, which wasn't there before, start to become more and more prominent. And they found, when they analyzed the raw data, that the people that stopped in the middle of the study and couldn't continue, they cancelled. They couldn't tolerate the medications. They went out maybe a week or two later and committed suicide. Well, they weren't included in the study. They were completely locked out and weren't counted. And yet the reason that they went out to commit the suicide was because they were having an issue with the medications they were on in the trial. So
Sandy, you're very well read.
Going on.
If you've read Gotcha, am I pronouncing that right? Because I always get it wrong.
Peter Gotcha is like
Gotcha. Okay, you're better Swedish with your Swedish language than I am for some reason.
Oh, so, I studied German when I was in high school.
Gotcha. Thank you for the correction. So that book was one of the most. I mean, I've got 500 references, and you can easily access them through clicking through the ebook, right? But that book it's exceedingly depressing. I could hardly make my way through it myself, even though I knew most of the material in it, or I had a pretty good idea. But that guy is the most prominent intellectual in evaluating medical corruption, and I appreciate you greatly for reading it, because I haven't run into anyone else who's read Gertrude before.
I
So
saw him do a
yeah.
speech. He came to Australia a number of years ago when he launched that book, and I went to see him give a presentation, and he is absolutely brilliant,
He's
wonderful,
brilliant.
lovely, gentle man with
Yeah.
with an amazing spirit. And I just had to read it, because I do know some people. I'm sure everyone knows some people who have dealt with mental health issues,
Who've been
and so
destroyed by the drugs.
you have been destroyed. And there are other issues that pop up, like they develop diabetes and heart disease, and it really shortens their lifespan. And in all of the studies and the reviews, they found once people are on these psychiatric drugs for a number of years, their lifespan is shortened compared to the people that don't go on those drugs.
It's certainly true for the atypical antipsychotics. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it's true for the SSRIs and the benzos. So, did you realize that Gertrude was thrown off the Cochrane?
Yes, and he's the founder.
Yeah, he's
well, it
one
was
of the founders. It's
taken over
outrageous. Yeah, it's outrageous.
by
I mean,
pharmaceutical
basically,
interests.
yeah,
So
that's right.
we know what
So you've
happens
kept
when
up
that.
with it.
Yeah.
Good for you. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so I think that serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are also quite dangerous, because I've read subsequent studies that revealed when you block the reuptake of the serotonin and you overload the system with serotonin, it oxidizes and becomes toxic. And so then you have a ricochet, a slingback effect, which is very detrimental. So they don't know how to balance it. So they've got theories, and they'll go, well, we'll add this to the potion. I found, when I've dealt with a few psychiatrists through people I've known, I've tried to help them, spoken to the psychiatrists, and they seem to experiment. They don't really have.
It's
I
called the
asked, what's
trial
the
therapy.
mechanism of action? What
Yeah.
are you aiming to do? So I know someone who has autism that had a meltdown. All they needed was something to deal with anxiety, something very simple, and some talk therapy, and a safe place, and they would have been fine to gather themselves together. But instead they were given antipsychotic drugs and then became addicted. So then they had reactions to every single psych drug. They took them through the whole toolbox that they have, all the different ones. We'll try this. If that doesn't work, we'll try that. If that doesn't work, we'll try that. There doesn't seem to be any plan or any idea of what anything is supposed to do. It's so hit and miss. I don't get it.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's crazy. So we could go through these drugs from probably least toxic to the most toxic, and the probably least toxic is the benzos. So those are like the Xanax, Valium type drugs,
yeah.
Librium. And those things are quite addictive. And let's give Xanax as an example. Xanax is a short-acting drug. 3 hours after you take it, the anxiety returns. You get a rebound anxiety. You feel terrible. The initial studies on Xanax were performed over, I think, 6 or 8 weeks. And for 3 weeks, they did better, something like this. For 2 or 3 weeks, they did the same. And then the last couple of weeks, they did much worse. And the drug was approved despite this for short-term use. And of course, it immediately became one of the best-selling drugs of all time, maybe the best-selling drug of all time, and became used. People were popping them like, M&Ms. So the second class of drugs is the SSRIs, which we alluded to. These drugs have a major problem with violence and suicide. Now, it's not everyone, but it's a couple of percent of people have, and it may be higher numbers have suicidal thinking or violent thinking. But there are a lot of people commit suicide with these things. It was known in the initial trials by Lilly of Prozac, and it was concealed and brought out in testimony during several cases. And Lilly spent decades settling these cases. They've spent, as of 15 or 20 years ago, they've spent $50 million. I'm sure it's a heck of a lot more now. So those drugs are flawed. They're tremendously addictive, and the withdrawal symptoms mimic the original syndrome. So it's hard for anyone to get a feeling for just what is going on because they think their problems are coming back.
Well, and they're
Whereas,
told, I think that they're told by the psychiatrists, they're not side effects, they are your
yeah,
disease.
exactly.
So it's a revolving door.
So in the third world where these drugs can't be afforded or are not given as frequently, these entities like depression or whatever they're given for anxiety, they're they have the same aspects that we were taught in medical school. And I'm 67, so that was a long time ago. But we always were taught that these things come and go, that most of the people don't have severe continuous symptoms. But for modern America and for Australia, of course, these drugs are prescribed so promiscuously and everyone's addicted to them. And so the incidence of people getting on chronic disability and having chronic psychiatric disease has gone through the roof, and in tandem with the drug use. And the smart observers like Gertrude think that's causal. It's caused by the drugs, which makes sense to me.
Yes, so we have a drug problem in whole populations, and that needs to be addressed because it's not really heading in a good direction. It needs to be turned around.
The street drug problem is a joke compared to the prescription drug problem. Now, it's not quite a joke because in America, the street drugs, at least I believe the opioids resulted in 93,000 deaths last year, which was up from 60,000, which was up from a baseline of about 50,000 over the last 4 or 5 years prior to that. The Gertrude estimates that the fatalities in the US and Europe due to prescriptions are 250,000 deaths a year. Now that sounds conservative to me. I don't know how we could come up with a figure, but they're phenomenally toxic. And it's not just the psych drugs, it's many, many other medications.
Yes, opioids are a big problem. I did read too that a lot of addictions come from if people have had an accident or an injury and then they have to have surgery and they are introduced to these pain medications as a way to deal with the recovery from that operation, and then they can't come off them.
Exactly. What we've done is 20 years ago, roughly, we changed our opioid policy. And this was at the prompting of a drug company named Purdue, which publicized these ideas that the opioids were, their particular opioid called OxyContin was basically harmless, not addictive, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's just another variant in the opioids, which we've known about for hundreds of years, originally synthesized from poppy plants or made from poppy plants, and now, made in the laboratory. And it wasn't true. And so what we did is we exposed a vast swath of our populations to opioids, and 5% of us are very vulnerable to these drugs. That's just a wild guess. But these people get addicted and they never get off of it. They never are able to operate and function normally again. And many of them need the drugs in order to just get up in the morning and do whatever they have to do, let alone going to work. So that produces the addiction problems. It produces the street drugs are used because once the physicians became aware of it and the medical societies and the medical boards, they censured the doctors prescribing these things. So immediately we turned to the street drugs, and the Mexican black tar heroin just came running across the border, no problem. And they would often the dealers often operated right outside the pain clinics. So it's just been a tragedy here.
It's a business of disease, isn't it? It's profitable to keep people sick, really.
Well, if you think about the psych drugs, these physicians in cooperation with pharma have enabled prescribing of psych drugs, and not just one, but multiple psych drugs, to 17% of our population. 12% last year were placed on antidepressants, which is it's just a stunning thing. Now, that's a great profitable thing for pharma, but just imagine when they can get a narrative going that a vaccine needs to be taken by everyone. I mean, that is a profitable drug when you've got something for everyone. With these psych drugs, they're looking for new markets, and they're claiming that people should be prevented from having depression, who have heart attacks. In other words, they use them prophylactically. That's an enormous market too. And it's a crazy idea because the drugs are so toxic and so addictive. And like you, I have many friends that are stuck on Prozac or other SSRI antidepressants because in my opinion, their brain's damaged. They just can't get off of it without undergoing horrible withdrawal. It can take a year and a half or 2 years of tapering doses to get off of one of those medications.
Yes, you do. You lose brain cells. Actually, brain cells become destroyed over the years of use of those psychiatric drugs. And this is confirmed by several studies.
Well, that's certainly true for the antipsychotics, and it's true for amphetamines and the amphetamine relatives. I don't know about the SSRIs. I haven't read that, but they're a disaster if you have to keep taking this thing that blunts you out and makes you numb and doesn't enable you to do the most important job of your life, which is interpret your pain and act, and be a clear agent of your own, be an agent of your own
Well, that's interesting. That brings us back to taking the aspirins instead of looking at the real reason that you have a problem. It's the old saying, if you have a pain in your foot, rather than taking an aspirin, take your shoe off and get the stone out. We should be looking really for what is causing the problems. And so that's where I want to go with this. Surely everything can come back to some kind of pathological reason, some kind of physical cause. And we just sometimes don't know what that is. And if there's a vacuum and we don't understand what's caused this person's mental problem, then we just automatically prescribe drugs. Well, don't know, but, this will numb and dumb it down. Just feel the pain and off you go. And, as you said, they eat them like candies. But what happens is we destroy our lives and the quality of life is destroyed, and we become more and more dependent on the pills like junkies. And we have a junkie society, which is very scary. What about future generations? We're really heading for, I think, a population demise because we're not addressing the fundamental issues of the cause, the a priori primary cause, and a chain reaction that happens in the body physically. And so I'm quite interested in the new areas of neurobiology and looking at how the brain works. Now we have all this wonderful technology where we can do scans and we can measure the activity of certain parts of the brain in relation to something else. And we have controls and we can see much more now with the technology than we did many decades ago. When psychiatry, as you said, started to hop on the drug bandwagon, which is the easy answer. And, now funding is reduced from hospitals. That's often all they have. There are no psychologists, no talk therapists. There's not enough sociologists, social workers to go around and talk to people to try and resolve issues. So they're in a revolving door. They keep having, perhaps if it's PTSD, a repetitive thought which came to them from the trauma they've experienced wherever it might have been in a war situation or an accident or something's happened traumatic, and they can't get out of that revolving door thought, and the constant same thought and the fear causes stress, never-ending stress. So what I think is that the stress chemicals actually start to erode us. They cause an acid free radical production system that just keeps churning and churning, and over time we just dissolve from this constant stress and no relief from it. We can't get back into the parasympathetic mode. We can't rest and digest properly because we're plagued with constant stress. And is the synthetic alternatives, the synthetic remedies in the hospital systems of medications and drugs and antipsychotics, all they do is delay problems and cause other worse problems. As I said before, this diabetes, the heart disease. So we leave ourselves open to liver problems, lots of other kind of health issues, we shorten our lifespan and we reduce the quality of life. Whereas when you mentioned before, other societies in the poorer countries, in the third world, for instance, they go back to nature. They eat a certain diet, they add herbs, they rest, and they have social interactions where people come and talk to them and they try and unravel issues. I try and get rid of the cause of the stress. And over time, the body heals and seals itself. It fixes itself when it's got all the environmental conditions there. So it's a question of adjusting the environment to help the body recover itself, because we have, I guess we have genes, we have programs in those genes that know how to heal and recover if the environmental conditions are there. And so that links us back to magnesium, because the more stress people have had, the more they lose magnesium. And then when we're short of very important nutrition, the body doesn't have the ingredients and the materials, even though it knows how to, it needs certain inputs to then heal and recover. And so I don't think, and the gut is very important, gut-brain connection. I was speaking to a psychiatrist a number of years ago, and I was commenting that all the people in that ward, they had very distended, swollen stomachs. And here they were feeding them a lunch of, white bread and buns and lots of processed carbohydrates. And they were all having massive amounts of gas and gastrointestinal issues. And of course, some people have gluten intolerance, and that's known to make people hyperactive. And so their answer was just to give them more Valium or more, whatever the drugs they were being administered, just to increase the dose to calm them down. They never looked at the diet that they were feeding the patients in the ward, that perhaps they are the triggers, or they're a big part of the triggers that cause those behaviors. So I would really think that in the future of medicine, we would look very much at the contribution of diet and genetics. Certain people with certain genetic predispositions are more sensitive, or they need a particular diet where someone else can tolerate something someone else can't. So we need to look at diet and genetics and, and nutrition, and rest, and some more talk therapy, because at the end of the day, we're human beings and we need love and we need relationship with others. We need to feel safe, and we need to feel safe in the company of others. And we just need a sounding board. Often we need just someone to be there to talk to that we trust, and to get those thoughts out, and to have a sounding board brings us back to a balanced position. Whereas if you're always in your own head, you've got unrealistic thoughts going through your mind all the time and no one to talk to about it. You don't even know that those thoughts are unrealistic, that they're just fantasy. But when you talk to someone, you start to realize you self-edit. And I think we've lost a lot of that talk therapy, self-editing. So I'd like psychology to be a major part of the remedies for people's mental health issues. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that we have changed the psychodynamic theory of psychology into the medication theory of psychology, and all this stuff about, missing chemicals in the brain and all this stuff. And it's all a bunch of hot air, frankly. I mean, it's no more solid than some of the psychological theories about the mother and the, wanting to sleep with your mother and all that stuff. So the psychiatrists have lost this vast majority of their credibility, in my view. Now, I can just outline quickly the other couple of psych drugs that are commonly used by the psychiatrists, if you like. The atypical antipsychotics. Now, the older antipsychotics, named like Thorazine, you've heard of that, I'm sure. They had this horrible side effect called tardive dyskinesia. And I don't know if you remember, you've ever seen anybody move their mouth in a funny way?
Yes. And the person I know, they had that that jaw goes to the side and they can't
Yeah.
control the tongue, and they're
That's a,
always walking back and forth. They can't sit still.
those are two different side effects which are closely related, and they are called extrapyramidal side effects of the antipsychotics, right? So those things, I believe they were available since the 60s, right? And so we gave us ability to completely knock out anyone who was causing an awful lot of trouble. But as to how efficacious they were on their long-term treatment, they probably weren't that good. But more recently, these atypical antipsychotics have been developed, and they were initially billed or advertised as having less of those horrible side effects, which actually boil down to brain damage because often they're chronic. And some of the studies have shown brain shrinkage with chronic use of these antipsychotics.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out the atypical antipsychotics have many of the same characteristics as the typical antipsychotics, but despite all this, they've been prescribed like jelly beans, and they've been given to people with depressions that aren't immediately amenable to the antidepressants, the SSRIs. They've been given to people with anxiety. I mean, the military people that have left the military, it must be a quarter of them have left the military with a sack full of medicines they're supposed to take every day, and they're all addictive. They basically ruin these guys' lives. Not universally, but in many cases.
It doesn't seem to make sense sometimes. They're given uppers and downers at the same time. They're giving them drugs to stimulate, and then they have to give them drugs to calm them down or to be able to sleep at night. So they have contradictory chemicals running through the body. I don't understand the theory of it. And then that causes other side effects, dry eyes and no spit and dehydration.
And brain damage, and brain damage.
Yeah.
No, a trial of therapy, in other words, trying something to see if it works, is a venerable way that doctors do certain kinds of medication, and they see what works the best. But the psychiatrists have taken this to a new level where they all have their individual grab bags of techniques that they use. There's nothing proven, virtually nothing proven, and these guys, they are their disease entities are poorly characterized, and nobody knows what works because the studies are inadequate. Historically, I sort of felt sorry for them for a long time until I understood how bad their treatments were. Historically, their treatments have involved brain surgery called lobotomy, which won a Nobel Prize at the time.
I read that last century. Yes,
outlawed.
And they developed ice pick surgery.
That's the same thing. And ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, which
electroshock
has a mortality or death rate of 1 in 1,000, and it creates permanent memory damage in many of them. And they crash their blood sugars with insulin, and they use cold therapy. They threw these poor people in bags of ice, and so on and so forth. And now there's some new abusive therapies developing. They give people with like low-grade anxiety and depression. They give them microdosing of these drugs of abuse like LSD. And so I think this is another abuse, but who knows? Maybe there's some merit in it.
I've actually heard some good reports coming out of those investigations into psychedelic medications, and that they're not addictive.
Well, there were good reports about ECT and lobotomy too, and they weren't just good. It won the guy the Nobel Prize. So I'm skeptical, Sandy. I'm skeptical, and I'm not skeptical about human contact and talk therapy, and even physical restraint.
Yeah. And I think in the old days, doctors performed much better as family physicians, and they will get to know the whole family and the children and the parents and the grandparents, and there were generations that had the same doctor who would come and ask you what's been happening in your life and how are you feeling, and he would get, or she would get, a picture of their life, their stress levels, how things were going. You would get like a whole picture and get an understanding and get involved with that family and know a little bit more about the dynamics of what might be causing a particular problem. And then, there's the placebo effect as well. So the doctor might prescribe, you do this and you have your chicken soup and you have some herbs and you whatever. And people would believe so much. So whatever the doctor said to do, then actually their own body would start healing, because there's a component, which is the mind-brain connection, the mind power itself. And we see this with people like Wim Hof, who've been able to train their mind to actually control biological processes, body temperature, lots of things can be controlled by mind if you train it, but also your own belief in if something is happening. I think there should be a lot more research into the placebo effect. If the mind is so powerful, then maybe we can use it in medicine as well.
That guy's quite a phenomenon. He's a worldwide phenomenon, isn't he? Wim Hof.
He says everyone can do it.
Well, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to do it. I don't think I've got the fortitude to walk through the snow and all that. So the fourth drug that psychiatrists use, and they have promoted with the help of their industry sponsors, and industry gives their organizations just enormous amounts of money, are the amphetamines and the amphetamine relatives. Now, amphetamines are a century old or something like that, and we have known of their addictive qualities and their negative effects for, just forever. And these were the drugs that the kamikaze pilots took to go up in the air and try to blow up American ships during World War II. And Japan has now a reaction against all these medications, and they basically, they're psychiatry deniers, the whole country. You get thrown in jail if you enter the country with Prozac. True story. Now you can bring your little excuse, and sometimes they give you permission to bring in a small supply, but it's not something that's these psych drugs are not really allowed in Japan.
I have a great respect for the Japanese. Yeah,
I do too.
They're big into gut health and fermented foods.
Well, they don't have an obesity problem at all. And we went to Japan last year, and it was amazing. You could see their muscles through their clothes. I mean, it was just entirely different than America.
Yeah, and they live longer. They have many more centenarians.
Our average mortality is not, it's like number 20th or 30th in the developed countries. It's not that good.
Yeah, I think things need to be improved. So we have examples from around the world that we can emulate. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to review what works and be brave enough to change it, and be brave enough to, we need to change the medical system that's now become a junkie. Even so our government sponsored medical systems have also become junkies, in a sense, that become totally reliant on the pharmaceutical industry to solve all their problems. And there's no alternative coming from that side of things. So people need to take control of their own lives and hopefully not need to end up in hospital or not need to have medications by self-managing, diet and nutrition and lifestyle and relationships. And but if you have an accident, you have something unforeseen that happens which causes a trauma, then you will end up in that hospital system and maybe get some drugs into you that potentially can cause addictions down the track. So we have to really try and educate everyone about what's happening underneath the whole system. It's like white ants destroying something, and it looks on the surface like things are going fine, but underneath it's all eroding away. There are no answers. It's getting worse. Hospital systems are being overloaded. They don't really have enough solutions for future changes that need to be done. That really has to come probably from a grassroots level. And our new doctors coming through the system, hopefully that they take it upon themselves to learn more about environment and nutrition as a way to solving or preventing problems, as a prophylactic.
I want to emphasize that if you have a complicated problem, that you need healthcare, and that we do miracles all the time, every day. But it's just, for most of it, you basically need help in navigating the healthcare system, and you almost need a physician level expertise to figure it out. So do your research and don't.
How do we help all the people that have become addicted, that really want to get off those medications, that hate the side effects, but they're scared, they're afraid because they don't want to have worse side effects in the detox part of coming off those drugs? We need more specialists to handle how do you come off medications like that.
It can require a compounding pharmacist to make out up tapering doses, and sometimes it takes over a year to get off one of those drugs. And you can endure tremendous anxiety and depression and whatever your original problem was during that period. And it's not worth it for a lot of people because their brains are now accustomed to the drugs and they're stuck.
They're more likely to just keep doing the easy thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, good health is hard work. It requires effort. And I think perhaps it's just the way people think in society, the instant noodles approach, whatever's easier, but whatever's easier isn't necessarily good for us. And in the long run, can destroy us.
That's true.
So is there anything you would like to add before we wind up this amazing interview?
Well, I really appreciate your time, Sandy. And I think drug world is a strange place. And I think, I can talk about the COVID vaccine if you want. I'm not an expert at the vaccine, but I know these companies, and I think that it's a remarkable story. These companies are telling us this thing works, and it doesn't appear to even be a vaccine. In other words, it doesn't confer immunity and gives about 2 months worth.
In fact, this latest statistics coming out from around the world is that the influx of people with COVID are now the vaccinated ones. Well, we need a different word because it's not a vaccine.
Yeah,
the ones that have had the genetic modification.
Yeah, they've had the jab, right?
It's a GMO. So I deal with a lot of people in our business and industry. It's natural and organic, and everyone, wants to, as much as possible, avoid chemicals and live a natural life. And so there's in America, you've got moms across America. They've been very strong lobbyists against the GMO movement, because it's a corruption of the food supply. It's not very healthy. The foods aren't good, full of the nutrition that we need compared to naturally grown organic foods, which are very high in very nutrient dense. And so this doesn't help our children. It doesn't help our future generations. We need to try and get back to the basics, really. And the current drive towards a mandated medical treatment, which is unproven and hasn't gone through a proper long-term testing, is so dangerous. We don't know if it's going to cause cancer.
Yeah,
we don't know.
I'll quote Orwell to close. Pfizer was initially claiming the vaccine had a, quote, efficacy of 95%. Orwell's 1945 quote about the delusions of academics applies to this, quote, "One has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool." That's what I think about the vaccine. How these companies are so powerful, Sandy, that they're flexing now, and they don't even care whether we believe what they're saying. You realize pharma has a 1.3 trillion worldwide gross revenues, and our federal government here in the United States only about 4 trillion. All of healthcare in the United States is bigger than the federal government, roughly. It's at least the same size.
It's one
You
big
know,
beast.
it's a
The,
beast.
the
And then
beast.
as far as the tech companies go, Apple alone has a market cap of 2.5 trillion, half the size of the federal government. I mean, these people are just out of control. There's no way to take them down now, and I don't know where we're going with it.
It reminds me of parasites that have taken over a host
The
organism.
host. Yeah, that's right.
Humanity on the planet is the host. And eventually, if the parasites get too top heavy and start skimming off too much and putting too
Everybody
much
dies.
toxin in,
Yeah.
what happens to the host? They kill the host, and then their own survival is predicated. So it's we're in a situation where we have to detox and get rid of the parasites that are abusing the system, that are putting toxins into the system. We can't survive. It's not sustainable.
We hear that Australia is far worse as far as the lockdowns than the United States. Is that true?
Yeah, so we do have a constitution. It's not really as comprehensive as the US, but we have a constitution that says that, it follows the Nuremberg protocols, and you're not allowed to mandate medical procedures, and people should have freedom to travel between states, and so we have certain rights specified, but the governments are not following our constitution. So the federal government sits back and lets each state, you would call them governors, we call them premiers, each state premier to kind of make up their own rules, and they're different rules in each state. And then they lock down the state. So we're currently having a lockdown. So the Queensland borders are in full lockdown. Nothing travels across. And you can only travel across if you're an essential service or a courier and you've had the jab. So they're using rules to force people to have this medical procedure, or you can't live, you can't work, you can't do anything. You're in a prison. They put you in a prison and say you can have freedom only if you take this needle. It's awful.
I'm going to tell you something about Americans. They love Australians. We idealize Australians. It seems to us like everything's free and easy over there. But I think, like a lot of other people, I'm disappointed in you guys. I'm really disappointed.
Well, look, we're only 25 million. And because we've been the lucky country, which is a classical term that's been used for generations, the lucky country, because we have an abundance of resources and, a beautiful country and, surrounded by ocean and a beautiful environment. And we've been able to sell wool and produce, and, we've been very fortunate because of those resources. So people come here, have a very nice lifestyle, and over generations, we got used to nice lifestyle, and we become very easygoing as a culture and known, we're friendly, come and visit us. And, we love the tourists and we'll show you a good time and all of that. And it's still all current. But because we've been living in La La Land, we've got further and further away from the potential of parasites coming in. And, they're like cockroaches in the corners. You can't see them in the cupboards. And if you keep the cupboards closed, they'll do whatever they want in there. But we won't open the cupboards because we're afraid of what we'll see. And so there's got to be a real reality check. My view is that there will be a lot of pain before the population wakes up enough. Having said that there is quite a significant smaller population becoming very active. And apparently we're heading in the next few days for a truckers lockdown. They're going to block the highway.
I read about that. Yeah, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, well,
I wish our truckers would lock down.
They're killing small businesses and nobody seems to care. And it's really awful because small business represents 60% of Australia's GDP. All our economic cash flow depends on small businesses out there. They're efficient, they get the job done, they give the customer service. and the money that they get as income goes back out into the economy and circulates. No one's sending it off to tax havens anywhere. Small business just rolls it around and around. And so healthy economies need that kind of cash flow. And what are they doing? They're stopping the small business, stopping the cash flow, causing a major, major disaster. But you can be free if you take this needle. So it's an economic forcing. It's an economic it's a bit like Stockholm Syndrome as well. They're making people believe that they're the cause of the problem.
Yeah, I know.
And
it's
so
crazy.
It's your
the truckers
fault.
are against the jab, correct?
Sorry?
The truckers are against the vaccine.
Well, apparently 50% on the surveys are refusing to get it. And many of them have put out videos and their commentary and saying, we are sitting for several hours every day driving trucks, and we have higher vulnerability to getting thrombosis. And they don't want to put themselves in a further risk situation.
I have a friend who died of a stroke a week after he got the vaccine.
Yeah, so so I've seen many scientists and doctors coming out with the studies that they've done using a D-dimer test, which shows that people getting the GMO injections are developing microclots. So that you can't see them on a normal scan, but you can see them with the D-dimer test. And each time you get another injection and another one, and they anticipate this being needed to be done year after year, which is going to be great for the coffers of the pharmaceutical companies. Each time you do it, you increase the little cellular factories that are making the spike protein, which apparently is the toxin.
Yeah, that's too far into the weeds for me. I don't know anything about that. But what I really liked about what you said was the Stockholm Syndrome. That's where we are right now. We've got the people that are all excited about trying to force everybody else to get the freaking jab. They're trying to encourage they're trying to spread their Stockholm Syndrome, and they literally are in the thrall of these corporations. So it's an outrageous.
And our media is totally bought. There's no more balanced reporting at all. There's no more, well, we'll hear from this side and now we'll hear from the other side. There's nothing. It's complete 100% propaganda. And then they will belittle or make fun of people who dare to ask a question. And I don't know if you know this, but in Australia, it is a 6-month jailable offence for a doctor to prescribe hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID.
That's awful. Yeah, there's a robust evidence for both ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Now, hydroxychloroquine, even there was a CDC paper on their journal that came out supporting hydroxychloroquine. Vitamin D, we know a lot about too.
Yes, and zinc.
Yeah, and zinc. So
and always vitamin C and magnesium as well, because magnesium helps the electrical system function. So it cofactors with all of those other nutrients to supercharge their effect.
Sandy, with women like you on our side, I don't think they're going to be able to count us out.
Well, they say you should do what you can do in your circle of influence. So I do what I do. Yeah. I mean, I can't go to Parliament House and tell the politicians, we can write emails, but, they tend to live in their ivory towers and not really listen these days, least of all.
I hope this doesn't degenerate into widespread violence because the things have been getting worse for 18 months. It's crazy.
Well, you think psychologically about people that through these regulations and lockdown mentality have lost everything. What else have they got to lose? And they're going to be really angry. So I've noticed the population is getting increasingly angry. And it's got to go somewhere. It's got to pop. It's got to be.
I want to see some of that good Australian,
like a pimple.
Good Australian spirit that Americans think you guys are independent and not so. I wouldn't have thought Australia would have been susceptible to this mind control.
Well, we were late. We were late. Yeah. The excuse was that we can't get the Pfizer, we
Because you're an
can't get the
island.
Astra, they're not
Yeah.
coming and we're late. So we started after everyone else. And I think some of the politicians wanted to sit back and watch what was happening everywhere else. And I even heard one comment last year when it first broke, we'll just see what's happening everywhere else first, which I thought, well, that's a safe approach. That's a good thing. Observe and then make a decision. But then somehow they got caught and the propaganda became stronger and stronger. In piecemeal, they just completely changed tack and became so totalitarian, and it's 100% and you do this or not. And they brought in, I mean, Melbourne and Sydney. Melbourne has had the hardest run of all of the cities. Victoria, that state is really it's like North Korea to me. It's like they've got police in those what are the helmets and the riot squad, and
that's too bad.
We don't see that in Queensland. Queensland's a little bit more laid back. They had a protest last Saturday. Several thousands of people marched through the street very peacefully. They were playing music and the police were there just directing the traffic. Nothing happened, gave a few speeches, and so we had no incidences, but that's not put on TV. What they showed on the news broadcast was the riots in Melbourne and how they used tear gas and rubber bullets, and they put tear gas in a 12-year-old's eyes, and good ordinary people that were just out to walk, to make their voice heard, to say, we don't agree with what you're doing. They're being hurt and abused and attacked. I mean, no one in their wildest imagination in Australia would have believed that this was possible, because we believed all the time we lived in a free society. We have a democracy. This is like a bad dream, and people are still thinking it's a bad dream, and any moment they're going to wake up from that bad dream and it's all going to be over. And it's not. It just keeps getting worse. It's like we're surrounded now in a nightmare, and it has to. I think it will explode. There will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the politicians, they won't be able to handle it. I think they are just following orders. I think it comes down from maybe globalist systems. The World Economic Forum and
financial.
So Switzerland and London and even the Vatican.
I think it's the big corporates.
The big corporates, the big money, the big money is running it all, the bankers. In Australia, we call them the wanker bankers.
Well, Sandy, anyway, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you.
Knowledge is power. And I think people just need to sit down and think more clearly and, work out, just go back to common sense. COVID was just like a normal cold and flu. Statistically didn't kill any more than an average flu season, or maybe a little bit more than an average, but still within that range where there should never have been a pandemic called at all, because that then gave the power to legislate and to create governmental controls and to reduce everyone's freedom and rights. And so something's gone wrong with the system where it allowed people to change the definition of a pandemic. And then now it's become a case-demic. Just because you have cases,
it's ridiculous,
justifies lockdown. And the PCR test is even proven to be false.
Fatalities is
not
the
reliable.
Only robust. Fatalities is the only robust measure of the thing.
And overall deaths aren't even worse than previous years. So what the hell's happening?
Overall deaths, that's it, right, the absolute figure. It's crazy. Well, Sandy, thank you again. It's been wonderful chatting.
Thank you too. And if anyone is interested, hopefully they are. I'm sure they would be. Your books are quite riveting. I found your writing really easy to read. Yes, butchered by healthcare. That gives you a snapshot and overview of a lot of different components in the medical system. And then the other one, Hormone Secrets, focuses on managing hormone balancing safely and without necessarily using drugs and medications, but knowing how to tweak things the right way. And I always love your attention to being careful with your protocols. And we all need to do that, and we all need to be more aware, and we all need to look for our better doctors who are more aware of things like this, and have a better protocol, and not just going for the easy pills. If it's a doctor that will just write you a script without really understanding what's going on, find another doctor. That's my advice. So Dr. Yoho's website is robertyohoauthor.com. That's www.robertyohoauthor.com. And I'll leave the link in the list underneath our video. And thank you very much for this wonderful chat. And hopefully people will get a lot out of it.
Thank you, Sandy.
All the best.
Okay, bye.
Bye.